Hello, my name is Judy Owens. I will be your presenter today on our Center for Smoke-Free Policy presentation called Smoke-Free Legislation, History, Policy, and Implementation. My name is Judy Owens. I am a 1992 graduate of the University of Kentucky College of Law. I practiced in Eastern Kentucky for a number of years in the areas of workers' compensation, in plaintiff's work at a different time, and then finally in the county attorney's office. At that time, I left legal practice. I worked in Governor Patton's administration on behalf of people with Appalachian issues. I eventually ran the UK Center for Rural Health, which I left in 2006, and I have since been doing some contract work, including work for the Center for Smoke-Free Policy. The purpose of this presentation is to help acquaint you with smoke-free policy in general and the state of Kentucky smoke-free policy in particular. Smoke-free policy, first I'd like to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. This webinar focuses on the history of the development of smoke-free policy globally as well as here in Kentucky. We're going to cover health, public policy, and legal implications because each of these is vitally important to the development of smoke-free policy and to the legal ramifications of smoke-free policy. And upon completion, you should have a better understanding of the rationale behind smoke-free laws, the history, and the legal refinements as smoke-free policies developed in Kentucky, and the current state of the law in Kentucky with regard to smoke-free law. I'd like to address one housekeeping issue at this moment. I do want to note that this presentation has been approved by the Kentucky Bar Association for continuing legal education credit, and your certificate of completion will be available at the conclusion of this webinar. Smoke-free policies are nothing new. In fact, they're quite ancient. Smoke-free policies have been enacted for hundreds of years, dating back to 1757. King James I published a treatise on anti-smoking back in 1604, and various popes in the 16th and 17th centuries threatened excommunication to those who smoked. A counterblast to tobacco was the name of the treatise that James VI wrote, and James I of England, of course. He expressed his utter distaste for tobacco, particularly tobacco smoking. It was one of the earliest anti-tobacco publications. It refers to medical theories of the times, including the four humors. In it, King James blames Native Americans for bringing tobacco to Europe and complains about passive smoking. He warned of danger to the lungs, and he decried tobacco's odor as hateful to the nose. As I said, various popes in the 16th and 17th century threatened excommunication to those who smoked, notably Pope Urban VII. He was a 13-day pope, but he did last long enough to enact the first known tobacco use restrictions in 1590, when he threatened to excommunicate anyone who, quote, took tobacco in the porchway of or inside a church, whether it be by chewing it, smoking it with a pipe, or sniffing it in powdered form through the nose. The earliest citywide European smoking restrictions were enacted in Bavaria and certain parts of Austria in the late 17th century. Concerns about the addictive qualities of tobacco continued through the 17th and 18th century in Europe. So why smoke-free policy in the modern world? Smoke-free policy and advocacy was well documented in terms of the health effects for decades, particularly in the post-World War II era. But the watershed was in 1964 when the Surgeon General issued a report establishing a connection between smoking and increased mortality rates from lung cancer, heart disease, and emphysema. Several reports completed in the 1980s found that secondhand smoke causes severe health risk and that tobacco products are addictive. The Surgeon General, for example, William H. Stewart, had a three-part report from 1967 to 1969, following up on the 1964 report called The Health Consequences of Smoking. In 1983, there was another major report that basically held that cigarette smoking should be considered the most important of the known modifiable risk factors for coronary heart disease in the United States. And in 1988, a report on nicotine addiction brought certainty where the 1964 report had hedged, concluding that cigarette smoking is addicting. So, delving in a little more to the 1964 report, the Surgeon General was Luther Terry at that time. And here he is making the announcement regarding the cigarette smoke and its health effects. This report was unique for a number of reasons. First, it focused entirely on the negative health effects of smoking. It noted that cigarette smokers had a 70% increase in age-corrected mortality, that cigarette smoke was the primary cause of chronic bronchitis, and there was a correlation between smoking, emphysema, and heart disease. Now, these findings were important, but really there was a cultural change in the 1964 report in the United States. There started to be restrictions on the type of advertising that tobacco companies could do. Warning labels became required on tobacco products, and there were widespread investigations of some of the practices of the tobacco industry. The next major landmark in these types of reports was Surgeon General C. Everett Koop's 1986 report called The Health Consequences of Involuntary Smoking. It's unique in that it decisively portrayed secondhand smoke not just as an annoyance but a quantifiable health risk. Involuntary smoking is a cause of disease, including lung cancer, in healthy non-smokers, General Koop found. Compared with children of non-smoking parents, children whose parents smoke have an increased frequency of respiratory symptoms and infections. They also have slightly smaller rates of increase in lung function as the lung matures. Simple separation of smokers and non-smokers, Dr. Koop held at the time, within the same airspace may reduce but does not eliminate secondhand smoke exposure. This report also reviewed current policies restricting smoking in public. Subsequent important reports on secondhand smoke were Surgeon General Richard Carmona's 2006 report, The Health Consequences of Involuntary Exposure to Tobacco Smoke. This report concluded that there is no risk-free level of exposure to secondhand smoke. In 2010, Surgeon General Regina Benjamin also issued a tobacco-related report entitled How Tobacco Smoke Causes Disease. This report showed that even short-term exposure to tobacco smoke causes immediate damage to DNA, lungs, and blood vessels. In the 2006 report, I'd like to note that non-smokers exposed to secondhand smoke at home or at work increase their risk of developing heart disease by 25 to 30% and lung cancer by 20 to 30%. Secondhand smoke caused approximately 7,333 lung cancer deaths and 33,951 heart disease deaths in the United States in 2006. The source for this statistic is the American Journal of Public Health. The Environmental Protection Agency lists environmental tobacco smoke, also known as ETS, as a Group A carcinogen. A Group A carcinogen means that it is known to cause cancer in humans. How does secondhand smoke cause disease? When you inhale secondhand smoke, 7,000 chemicals reach your lungs. Your blood carries poisons to the entire body. These poisons immediately damage the DNA, which leads to cancer, damages blood vessels and causes clotting, leading to heart attacks and strokes, and damages the lungs, leading to asthma attacks, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. The Surgeon General report of 2014 added conclusively that secondhand smoke exposure causes strokes. The most effective and least expensive way to limit exposure to secondhand smoke is by enacting smoke-free laws. Smoke-free laws have been enacted in the United States on both the state and local levels. The first United States state to enact a smoke-free statewide law was Minnesota. That was in 1975. The citation on that is Minnesota Statute 144-414. The first comprehensive statewide law was enacted in Delaware in 2002. Today, of the 60 most populated cities in the United States, all but 16 have smoke-free laws covering all bars and restaurants. Kentucky at this time does not have a statewide smoke-free law. A smoke-free bill has been introduced in the last 3 sessions of the Kentucky legislature. A bill was introduced in 2011 and was heard in the House Health and Welfare Committee, but was only presented for educational purposes, and there was not an intention to have a vote at that time. In 2012, there was also a hearing in the House Health and Welfare Committee, and at that time a bill passed, but there was not enough momentum for a full House vote. It was an election year, and many times in some jurisdictions this issue is controversial, and some legislators prefer not to have a vote on this matter attached to them when they're running for re-election. In 2013, there was another hearing before the House Health and Welfare Committee, and it also passed again as it did in 2012, and there was a lot of momentum in favor of this bill moving forward for a vote in the House. However, as the session wore on and as the vote became closer, some commitments were lost. The momentum turned and it became apparent that the bill would fail. So at that time, Speaker Greg Stumbo reassigned the bill to the Judiciary Committee for vetting for the main opposition argument, which had to do with property rights. After the judiciary hearing, there was no time for a full House vote, and therefore no legislation was passed. At the time of this recording, the General Assembly was considering a statewide smoke-free law in 2014, but there had not been a final conclusion. In spite of the fact that there has never been a statewide smoke-free law passed in Kentucky, local ordinances have proliferated. And you can see on the screen that there are a great many counties and cities in Kentucky that have coverage of smoke-free legislation based on local ordinances. Since 2003, 39 Kentucky cities or counties have enacted or adopted local smoke-free laws or Board of Health regulations. In Kentucky, 23 local laws or regulations cover all workplaces and public places, including restaurants and bars. They are considered comprehensive. You can always go to www.kcsp.uky.edu for updated listings, a map, and details of each of these local ordinances. 3 localities have laws prohibiting smoking in public places only. It's worth noting that ordinances like this do not protect all workers. An additional 13 localities have smoke-free policies with significant exemptions. These exemptions also leave many workers uncovered. Campbell County passed a comprehensive law on December 15, 2010, but a newly seated fiscal court repealed it on February 16, 2011. It's very important to note here that the main impetus behind developing a smoke-free law is to protect the public health, and particularly to protect the public health of people who do not smoke but who are exposed to cigarette smoke. If a locality does not implement a comprehensive law or a comprehensive regulation, then it is without a doubt impossible to protect everyone at work. It's very difficult to understand a scenario in which a person should be required to breathe smoke, which is a known carcinogen, while they're in their workplace. So that's from the health reasoning, that is that the purpose behind passing the law to begin with is to protect health. And if you don't have a comprehensive law, you really are not protecting everyone's health. Now, in some instances, health departments in Kentucky have used their authority to abate nuisances to public health by creating a health department regulation to restrict smoking. One such regulation is currently being challenged in Bullitt County. We'll discuss this more later in the presentation, but the health department won its case at the Court of Appeals, and now the case is on appeal before the Kentucky Supreme Court. From the vantage point of the Center for Smoke-Free Policy, comprehensive smoke-free laws are the gold standard. Why? Because it's the most effective way, and by the way, one of the least expensive ways, to protect all workers and the public from secondhand smoke. Exemptions are sometimes sought for political reasons or for practical reasons. But in the experience of the Center for Smoke-Free Policy and in other organizations nationwide, we found that exemptions, instead of building consensus, tend to create litigation points for cities and counties. There are numerous examples of this all across the country, but one well-known one involved the city of Louisville. When the city of Louisville decided to pass a smoke-free ordinance, there was a request made that they exempt Churchill Downs. Of course, Churchill Downs had been a very traditional place for racing, and one of the things that people felt like went along with racing was being allowed to smoke in the stands. So when Louisville passed its smoke-free ordinance, there was an attempt to give Churchill Downs an exemption so that people could smoke while they were at the races. But it was very quickly determined that there really is no legal basis for allowing one place of business to be exempt. And so eventually Louisville went with a smoke-free law that also covered Churchill Downs. As far as the history of developing local ordinances in Kentucky, Lexington was the first place to enact a smoke-free ordinance in Kentucky. This was enacted by a vote of 11-3 at the Urban County Council, and it was the first Kentucky smoking ban. It did have to withstand a trip to the state Supreme Court. The implementation was delayed after the law was challenged by a group of restaurant and bar owners who were backed financially from Brown and Williamson. But after it came back from the Supreme Court in the case of Lexington Fayette County Food and Beverage Association, 131 Southwest 3rd, 745, Kentucky 2004, the law took effect. Basically took effect in April of 2004. The benefits were quick and dramatic. Nicotine levels, which is a measure of exposure to toxic secondhand smoke, declined by 56% among bar and restaurant owners. Lexington had 22% fewer emergency room visits for asthma in the first 32 months after the enaction of the ordinance. The law was strengthened in 2008 to include all workplaces in the Lexington-Fayette County urban area. Smoke-free laws continue to be the most effective and economic strategy for protecting non-smokers from exposure to secondhand smoke. While it seems apparent that state and local governments have the authority to pass smoke-free laws, they continue to be challenged. What I'd like to do is examine the challenges that were raised to the Lexington ordinance so that we can get an idea of how similar ordinances have been challenged. Basically, the Lexington Food and Beverage Association challenged the ordinance on 3 grounds. First is preemption, second, property rights, and third, vagueness. These are typical of challenges that are made nationwide to these ordinances. First, let's look at preemption. The association argued that the smoke-free law was preempted by state law. Now, it might be useful to spend a couple of minutes reviewing the doctrine of preemption. The doctrine of preemption is derived from the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution. The Supremacy Clause states that the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. In plain language, the doctrine of preemption means that there is a hierarchy of laws, where federal law trumps state law and state law trumps local law. In order for preemption to succeed, the U.S. Supreme Court relies on a 3-pronged test. Number 1, is the scheme of regulation so pervasive as to infer that Congress left no room for states to supplement it? Did Congress, in effect, preempt the entire field? Number 2, is the federal interest so dominant that the federal system will be assumed to preclude enforcement of state laws on the same subject? And number 3, does the state law produce a result that conflicts with the objective of the federal law? Now, if the case is of one of state preemption, that is, of a state law that preempts local, county, or city ordinances, these same standards would apply. So when the Kentucky Supreme Court examined the preemption argument advanced by the association, they rejected it. Their rationale was this: that municipal corporations have wide latitude under their police powers to create laws for the general welfare of its citizens. For this proposition, they cited the case of U.S. Mining and Exploration Natural Resources Company, Incorporated versus City of Betaville, Kentucky, 548 Southwest 2nd, 833, 1977. Under the 1980 Home Rule, cities may enact the cities may act without specific legislative authority from the legislature. So once Home Rule was enacted in Kentucky, cities are not required to wait for legislative action before enacting their own local ordinances. The case that the Supreme Court relied on for this proposition was Historic Licking River Side Civic Association versus City of Covington, 774 Southwest 2nd 436, 1989, and also the statute KRS 82.082. Finally, the association set out 5 Kentucky statutes that they cited as preempting the Lexington Ordinance. The court found that these 5 statutes do not meet the requirement of creating a comprehensive system of legislation regarding smoking. Specifically, the association cited KRS 217.005, which is the Kentucky Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, KRS 61.165, which governs smoking policy for state and local governmental offices, KRS 56.463, which authorizes the Finance and Administration Cabinet to adopt administrative regulations controlling state-owned and leased buildings, KRS 438.050, this imposes fines for those smoking on school premises, and finally KRS 196.245, which allows the Commissioner of the Department of Corrections to control smoking by inmates. The court found that these 5 distinct and narrow statutes did not create an intent by the Kentucky State Legislature to occupy the field, and therefore the state had not preempted smoke-free law in Kentucky in terms of localities like cities or counties. I would like to note that preemption arguments are rarely successful unless the state legislature has indeed adopted a statute that specifically creates a comprehensive state smoke-free law. I would offer the example of J.R.T. Colebrook versus Town of Colebrook. The citation is 829 Atlantic 2nd, 1089, New Hampshire, 2003. In this case, a New Hampshire city attempted to adopt its own smoke-free law when the state had already enacted one, and the New Hampshire Supreme Court held that the New Hampshire had already occupied the field and that a municipality was not allowed to enact its own ordinance. The second common argument that we hear with regard to constitutional challenges to smoke-free law is that of property rights, and this one was certainly associated in the Lexington case. The association argued that the ordinance is invalid because it infringes on the right of a business owner to conduct his business without impermissible interference from the government. The Supreme Court rejected this argument, citing Adams Incorporated for the proposition that localities have the broadest field in exercise of police power and in the area of public health. This argument basically derives from the Takings Clause of the U.S. Constitution, that is, that no private property may be taken for public use without just compensation. In these cases, plaintiffs don't argue that there has been an actual physical taking of their property, but rather they argue that the municipality has deprived the owner of the beneficial use of his land. Again, the Supreme Court rejected this argument. Finally, the third argument that is often advanced is the argument of vagueness, and this was also articulated in the Lexington case. Basically, the association argued that the statute was unreasonably vague. They relied on phrases in the statute such as, quote, reasonable distance from the outside entrance of any building, close quote, or smoking paraphernalia, and they argued that those specific phrases were vague. The vagueness doctrine just to articulate what the general principle of law here is. The vagueness doctrine was enunciated by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1972 in the case of Enacted versus City of Rockland. Citation on that case is 408 U.S. 401, and it sets out the principle on vagueness at 108. Quote, "It is a basic principle of due process that an enactment is void for vagueness if its prohibitions are not clearly defined." Close quote. So the standard for vagueness is a two-part test. Number one, whether the law gives the person of ordinary intelligence a reasonable opportunity to know what is prohibited so that he may act accordingly. And number two, whether the law provides explicit standards for those applying them to avoid arbitrary or discriminatory applications. In the Lexington case, the court upheld the reasonable distance provision. The court relied on Gurney versus Lexington Fayette Urban County Government. That's at 6 Southwest 3rd, 852, 1999, stating that a statute is not unconstitutionally vague if an individual affected by the ordinance would reasonably understand what is required of them. And of course, that language echoes the language in Enacted versus City of Rockland. The court, however, did strike down the smoking paraphernalia argument as vague. These arguments, preemption, property rights, and vagueness, are typical of those leveled against smoke-free laws. As in Kentucky, these opposition arguments are rarely successful across the country. Why is this? Because it's a long recognized principle of law that a municipality has broad latitude to adopt ordinances on the local level as well as regulations that promote and protect health, welfare, safety, and morals of its residents pursuant to the city's police power. It's recognized as an important, if not the most important, single function of a city. So because of this, there is a long-held assumption about that. Now, some may wonder about the enforcement of local laws, how these local ordinances are enforced. Enforcement provisions are set out in the local ordinance or regulation. Most involve fines for violations or misdemeanors. County or city attorneys may be asked to advise those designated to enforce the local ordinance or regulation. Who is asked to enforce the local ordinance or regulation? It could be any number of local entities. It could be the police, the fire department, a code enforcer, a fire marshal. Any number of entities could be asked to enforce, and that would spring into action your county or city attorneys to help interpret the true meaning of the ordinance or regulation. However, in the experience of the Center for Smoke-Free Policy, once the public becomes accustomed to smoke-free public environments, smoke-free becomes the new normal, and many localities have found these ordinances to be self-enforcing. And what I mean by that is that once everyone knows that, for example, in the Lexington, Fayette County urban government area, that it's not legal to smoke cigarettes in a restaurant. People rarely attempt to light a cigarette, but if they do, most other patrons are quick to point out that it's not allowed. And so bringing in other enforcement entities is often not required because these new smoke-free ordinances actually become the norm. Currently, 34% of Kentuckians live in places that protect them from secondhand smoke at the workplace or buildings that are open to the public. As a result, the smoking rate in Lexington, Fayette County dropped from 26% to 17.6%, and the community experienced a 22% drop in emergency room visits for asthma. So now that a number of communities in Kentucky have enacted smoke-free laws, these smoke-free laws have withstood legal challenges and are still on the books, and they seem to be self-enforcing for the most part, and they seem to be having the desired effect in improving public health. What unfinished business do we have with regard to smoke-free policy in our state? Well, one particular area is establishing by case law that health departments in Kentucky have the authority to adopt smoke-free laws. We have a case ongoing right now in Bullitt County that we hope will resolve this issue and will resolve this issue as it is now on appeal before the Kentucky Supreme Court. I'll give you a little bit of history about this. The Bullitt County Board of Health began considering regulations to limit indoor smoking after an air quality study showed that indoor air pollution in Bullitt County was 42 times higher than Louisville's after their smoke-free law was put into place. These findings were presented at a series of community forums throughout Bullitt County, beginning in August of 2010. A public opinion poll in Bullitt County showed that 75% of the citizens favored a local smoke-free regulation. However, the fiscal court declined to enact a smoke-free law. So after discussion with community members and after seeking legal advice, the Board of Health adopted a smoke-free regulation. That was on March 15, 2011. The fiscal court and 8 cities within Bullitt County sued to stop the health department from enforcing the smoke-free law. The local circuit court upheld the fiscal court's request. The circuit judge's ruling was then appealed to the Kentucky Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals disagreed. So the Kentucky Court of Appeals reversed the circuit court in Bullitt County by a ruling on December 7, 2012, in favor of allowing the Bullitt County Board of Health to implement its smoke-free regulation. The Court of Appeals held that the Board of Health has the authority to create regulations involving public health. The legislature clearly granted local boards of health the authority to adopt regulations as long as these regulations met several criteria. The criteria were that the regulation did not conflict with administrative regulations of the Cabinet of Health and Family Services. Second, that it was necessary to protect the health of people. And third, it was necessary to carry out the purposes of Kentucky law relating to public health. In previous cases, like Lexington Fayette County Food and Beverage Association versus Lexington Fayette Urban County Government, the Kentucky Supreme Court specifically held that protecting the public from exposure to environmental tobacco smoke can be the proper object of police power of local government. The Court of Appeals also considered whether the ordinances adopted by the Board of Health are reasonable. The Lexington case cited earlier found a similar ordinance reasonable, and the Court of Appeals followed the Supreme Court's judgment. The Bullitt County Fiscal Court appealed to the Kentucky Supreme Court on January 9, 2013, And the Supreme Court agreed on October 16, 2013 to grant discretionary review. There are broad policy implications for departments of public health beyond the narrow question of whether the Bullitt County Board of Health had the authority to enact a regulation, despite the fact that the fiscal court or none of the cities approved of it. There's been some recent writing about this topic, and some people feel that, and have said publicly, that they feel that the concept of a public health department required a wide range of authority for them when they were created. Kentucky statutes are very similar to most other state statutes with regard to the grant of authority. It's very broadly stated to abate nuisances, sources of filth, and causes of sickness. They're allowed to use all things reasonably necessary to carry out their duty. While this sounds very broad, there's a reason for it, and that is that the sources of sickness and disease can be anywhere. They can appear suddenly. They can have rapid and devastating consequences. So, using this kind of authority, not only Kentucky, but states all across the country were able to stop devastating threats like polio, smallpox, diphtheria. All these diseases were stopped or greatly abated by the use of these broad authorities by the health departments. Now, since the days when these were major health threats, health departments have expanded their role. They've looked into things like clean water, safe food in restaurants, treatment of preventative diseases like diabetes, and of course, what is the biggest preventable disease but diseases to the lung and other parts of the body caused by exposure to cigarette smoke. The result of these policies is really indisputable, that the lifespan of Kentucky is longer, their health is better, their quality of life is better, and so these are the rationales behind the broad grant of power to departments of public health regarding their ability to abate nuisances and address health issues. That said, we are still waiting for the Kentucky Supreme Court to render an opinion as to whether, in the case of Bullitt County, the health department overstepped its bounds when it enacted a smoke-free ordinance. So the next piece of unfinished business is whether or not Kentucky should have or would have a statewide smoke-free law. Some Kentucky legislators continue to support the idea of a statewide law restricting smoking. Others like the idea of continuing on a community-by-community basis. One thing is for sure, it will require both state and local elected officials to rid Kentucky of exposure to secondhand smoke in the workplace. City and county attorneys should be aware that a new statewide law, which was under consideration at the time of this recording in the 2014 session of the General Assembly, contains enforcement provisions that may require you to offer opinions to peace officers, employees of public health departments, and others with regard to citations about smoking violations. Again, we don't have a law in place yet, but in the event that we do, it's almost certain that city and county attorneys' advice will be sought. For example, definitions contained in a local ordinance may be changed if a state law is implemented. Also, provisions in the new state law, but not covered in the local law, would have to be addressed. And there are emerging questions that were not considered in the early days of smoke-free policy in Kentucky. This includes e-cigarettes, government vehicles, healthcare facilities, if covered under a state law, but not under local policies. So, the purpose of advocating for a comprehensive statewide law, as Kentucky cities and counties discovered when they enacted their local ordinances, exemptions create litigation points which can be costly for cities and counties to defend, while at the same time failing to protect everyone from the danger of secondhand smoke, and in fact undermining the core purpose for the ordinance. If there are exemptions to the state law or to local ordinances, then children will be more likely to see adults smoking in public places, as well as the places they work. And we know that that sort of modeling is what created addiction to cigarettes to begin with. If there are exemptions, people who are trying to quit will be faced with triggers to smoke and will be more apt to relapse. Exemptions mean that workers who are working in any place that's exempted from an ordinance will still be exposed to secondhand smoke, and we know that there is no serious dispute in the medical literature that exposure to secondhand smoke is a known human carcinogen and that it leads to premature death and chronic disease. And finally, all of these factors mean high health care costs for our citizens of Kentucky. So these are the reasons that Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policy has continued to advocate for a comprehensive laws, whether they're on the statewide level or on the local level. So with this, we're concluding our presentation. As I said earlier, I appreciate your time and attention. I've been working on this topic with the Center for Smoke-Free Policy for 6 years and have enjoyed counseling with all the localities about their efforts to craft ordinances and regulations that fit with the community desire to improve public health. And I'm excited about the new developments that are on the horizon. As I mentioned earlier, there is a certificate of completion at the end of this webinar, and I thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you. At this time, I think it's important to review some of the relevant cases and statutes that relate to this topic of smoke-free, and particularly with regard to the role of the public health departments in Kentucky. The authority of a local board of health to regulate smoking in public places has never been directly considered by the Kentucky Supreme Court, although, as we mentioned earlier, there is a case in Bullitt County that is currently under consideration, but at the time of this recording had not yet been decided. However, it is easy to see the potential thinking of the court based on previous cases. And one particularly salient case that I'd like to discuss is Louisville and Jefferson County Board of Health versus Haunts. This case can be found at 451 Southwest 2nd, 407, Kentucky Court of Appeals, 1970. In that case, the court held that boards of public health enjoy broad regulatory power, limited primarily by procedural safeguards to control the exercise of power and to provide for due process. The Haunts case, the Jefferson County Board of Health had instituted a regulation regarding the minimum standards for housing. That is, in order to be considered habitable, a home must meet certain minimum requirements, such as having running water, sewer service, a means of heat, light, and ventilation. Mr. Haunts, who owned several properties in the Jefferson County area, sued to prevent enforcement. Haunts cites with approval the publication of broad regulatory power in a variety of circumstances, not only in the case of this standard for habitability for housing, but also billboard law, prevailing wages, and programs for special education. The court's holding in haunts is instructive, and the actual language of the court is very clear. We are of the opinion that the regulations contained in the Sanitary Code are valid and are reasonably necessary to protect the health and welfare of the inhabitants of Jefferson County, that the regulations were adopted pursuant to enabling legislation, that sufficient safeguards are provided in the Sanitary Code to protect the public and to afford those affected by the code with due process of law, and that the regulations are within the framework of the legislation, the purpose of which is to protect the public health. So that's a very succinct articulation of the court standards in judging these cases. Now I'd like to take a look at some of the statutory regulations or requirements that will inform our understanding of the authority of boards of health. Boards of health in Kentucky are given a general grant of authority to adopt administrative regulations under KRS 212-230-1C, which provides that local boards of health may adopt, except as otherwise provided by law, administrative regulations not in conflict with the administrative regulations of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, necessary to protect the health of the people or to effectuate the purposes of this chapter or any other law relating to public health. Additional statutory provisions regarding health departments come under KRS 212-230-1H. This authorizes local boards of health to, quote, perform all other functions necessary to carry out the provisions of law and the regulations adopted pursuant thereto relating to boards of public health. In addition, under KRS 212-245-11, city and county or district health departments are given a final general grant of authority, and that authority has been articulated as, quote, except as otherwise provided by law, do all other things reasonably necessary to protect and improve the health of the people, close quote. So you can see that this is a broad, very broad, all things reasonably necessary grant of authority to the Departments of Public Health. So in applying those statutes, the court's analysis in the Haunt standard was that the regulation is reasonably necessary to protect the public health, and it relied on the procedural safeguards that were embedded within the statute to protect constitutional due process concerns. When you don't have a case directly on point, it's always helpful to look at cases from other jurisdictions that have considered similar issues. So, for example, in West Virginia, the West Virginia courts have held that the local health department can regulate indoor smoking, and I might note that West Virginia's statute that created their health departments is quite similar to the one in Kentucky. In Massachusetts, the courts agree that health departments do have the authority to create smoke-free regulations. In North Carolina, the court found a Board of Health regulation regarding smoking unconstitutional, but note the grounds upon which the court made its ruling in this case. The exemptions were based on economic concerns, and that's the basis upon which the North Carolina Supreme Court struck down the health department's regulation. keep in mind that the grant of authority to health departments is confined to the area of health, and that when health departments wander over into other topic areas, they may run afoul of constitutional concerns. Other jurisdictions that have considered this issue include Washington State. There, a health department regulation was struck down because it contradicted a state law. And again, as we've discussed earlier, one always has to consider preemption. At this point in Kentucky, there is no superior law, at least not that's been adjudicated by any courts in our state, that would preempt a local statute by a city or county or a Board of Health regulation. But in Washington State, there was an existing state law that regulated indoor air quality and smoking cigarettes. The health department contradicted that law, and of course, under the doctrine of preemption, it was struck down. And another example is in Ohio. Courts there found that 2 boards of health exceeded their authority in passing smoke-free regulations because the state law placed specific limits on health department regulation authority. So again, it's all a matter of statutory construction. In Ohio, their state law that created their boards of health placed certain limits on the health department's authority. But in Kentucky, our law does not have such limits. It's also important to examine the role of cities and the authority that cities have with regard to enacting their own regulations. Cities have the authority to act for the general welfare of the citizens of that community. Under the 1980 Home Rule, cities may act without specific legislative authority. This is very important because it sort of grants a blanket opportunity for cities to enact laws that they think come under their police power, even if there is no specific grant of authority from the General Assembly. This proposition was challenged and found to be constitutional in Kentucky, and the case in which it was challenged was Historic Licking Riverside Civic Association versus the City of Covington. The citation on that is 774 Southwest 2nd, 436, 1989. And of course, the Home Rule statute is located at KRS 82.082. One other topic that has come up regularly with regard to our Center for Smoke-Free Policy activities is an understanding by some citizens, and often this is something that is brought up by lay persons, that they believe they have a constitutional right to smoke cigarettes so long as they're an adult. As a matter of fact, the Constitution, both in Kentucky and in the U.S. level, is quite broad and grants quite a few civil liberties. Smoking cigarettes is not one of them. Case law throughout the country has firmly established that adults do not have a right to smoke cigarettes. Some relevant cases on this point are Grusendorf versus City of Oklahoma City. The citation for that is 816 Fed 2nd, 538. That's a 10th Circuit case in 1987. The City of North Miami versus Kurtz. Citation is 653 South 2nd, 1025. And Town of Plymouth versus Civil Service Commission, that's number capital SJC 07405. There simply is no constitutional right for an adult to smoke cigarettes. So in conclusion, the negative health effects of exposure to secondhand smoke are well documented, and it's been very easy for any local entity, be it the Board of Health, a city government, fiscal court on the county level, to establish either through their legislative authority as a health department or their police powers as a city, that there is a danger to public health from having people breathe secondhand smoke in an enclosed area. The second point I'd like to make in conclusion is that smoke-free ordinances have been enacted in the United States since the 1970s in many states and many localities. 38 localities in Kentucky do have local laws or ordinances. These ordinances have survived constitutional challenges, typical of those lodged against smoke-free ordinances, and we've already discussed what those typical challenges are, and that the Supreme Court has already upheld the constitutionality of local smoke-free ordinances. As far as in the future, we have some other issues that are coming up on the horizon. One is related to what we've discussed at length here, which is whether a local board of health has the authority to enact a smoke-free regulation. That's going to be considered soon by the Kentucky Supreme Court. And then the other issue is whether we want to have a statewide law here in Kentucky. That has been debated for a number of years, but at the time of this recording, it had not yet been enacted. On behalf of the UK Center for Smoke-Free Policy, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar and look forward to learning more about this important topic as events unfold.